Welcome to Politically Basic. I'm your host, Kyle Campbell. As we always do, we're breaking down the basics of all political issues and current political events so that you get to decide. If you're feeling like the issues of antisemitism, free speech, discrimination, and general discontent confusion surrounding the nation of Israel are escalating in this country, well, you're not alone. So let's talk truth and basics with my guest today, Shabbos Kestenbaum. He's the well-known writer, political commentator at PragerU, and recent Harvard graduate who's become a nationally recognized voice in the fight against anti-Semitism on college campuses, especially after he was the lead plaintiff in the lawsuit against Harvard University for failing to protect Jewish students after the October 7th terrorist attack. Shabbos quickly emerged not just as a leading advocate for Jewish students, but also gaining attention for his willingness to challenge powerful institutions and push for accountability. We like those things, Shabbos. Thank you so much for joining me on Politically Basic.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
Well, this is great. We have a lot to talk about. This issue of anti-Semitism, the issues surrounding our relationship with Israel, Zionism, a lot of these topics are still hot topics in this country. But let's start at the beginning. This is Politically Basic, so please tell my audience just a little bit about yourself and your upbringing that kind of led you into this world of political commentary.
Sure. Well, again, it's great to be here. And as you said, I'm an American. I was born here. I was raised here. This is the only country I know and love. I'm also an Orthodox Jew. I don't know if you can see the yarmulke, but I grew up in a household with 7 siblings, which is fairly typical for my community. I went to an all-Jewish day school my entire life. After high school, I then studied in the old city of Jerusalem in an all-male yeshiva, which is, again, fairly typical for my religious community. So I was living 2 minutes away from the Al-Aqsa Mosque, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, or the Western Wall. And it was in that environment that I decided I also wanted to study religion from a very pluralistic perspective, academic perspective, and non-sectarian perspective. That's where I got the idea of studying religion at Harvard. But I would say foundationally, I never once believed I had to choose between my American identity and my Jewish identity, because I don't view them as contradictory. In fact, I view them as quite complementary. As I said at the Republican convention, Jewish values are American values are Jewish values. And perhaps we'll get into this later, but on October 7th of 2023, which was the single largest day massacre of Jews since the Holocaust, where additionally 48 Americans were murdered by Hamas terrorists, more than a dozen Americans were taken hostage by Hamas terrorists. That was sort of my paradigm shift. I should also mention that I was not a conservative up until fairly recently. I was actually quite far left. I'm the only Orthodox Jew I know of who supported Bernie Sanders twice. I was 9 years old when I knocked on doors for Barack Obama when he was running for president the first time. I was 12 when I volunteered for the Cory Booker campaign. I marched when Roe v. Wade was overturned. I took knees with Black Lives Matter. So I think I have some degree of credibility, some degree of legitimacy to talk about what I view as the far left. I have some degree of legitimacy to talk about anti-Semitism at institutions of higher learning in the United States, and some degree of credibility to talk about the state of Israel and its relationship to the United States.
Well, that's amazing. Wow, you were a go-getter when you were young. I love talking to people who have that conviction early on and have a real path forward and go seek it. So that's really amazing and so impressive. Yes, I want to talk about all of those things. There's so much to get into, but I appreciate you kind of laying that foundation for us. Right now, you're currently working as a delegate for the World Zionist Congress. Is that right?
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't say working. I was elected to what's called the World Zionist Congress. It convenes once every 5 years. It was started by Theodor Herzl, who's known as the father of modern political Zionism. The first Zionist Congress was in 1897 in Basel, Switzerland. And so, as I said, the Congress convenes every 5 years, and it is a plethora of Jewish perspectives, very diverse, very opposing viewpoints, which is why I always laugh when people say that the Jews control XYZ, the Jews control Hollywood, Jews control the media. Jews can't agree on anything. And as proof, I would encourage you to come to the next World Zionist Congress. But I was elected on the slate of essentially empowering young American Jews. That's kind of my interests. And the World Zionist Congress does have a significant budget. They have about $5 billion. And I think a lot of that money should go in investing into Jewish diasporic communities.
Mm-hmm. Amazing. Thanks for explaining that. And then 2, you're with PragerU. So maybe you can share a little bit about your work with them.
Yeah, so that's my real job. That's my 9 to 5. That's what pays for my beautiful 1-bedroom apartment that you can see in the back. So PragerU is a political, let's call it edutainment conglomerate, entertainment and educational. We do have a conservative bent because we believe that what's best for the conservative movement is also what's best for the United States. And as I said, I'm new to the conservative movement. I've only been affiliated for basically 2.5, maybe 3 years. And I have a show with them, actually two shows. One is called The Brief, that's focused on politics. The other is Theological, that's focused on religion. But ultimately, it's a platform whereby I get to talk about the ideas that I really believe in, the ideas I'm passionate about, things like combating the demoralization of young people in America, things like a strong foreign policy, things like free market capitalism. And I'm very privileged that I get to be associated with an organization like PragerU and thinkers like Dennis Prager and Charlie Kirk and Ben Shapiro. I'm quite proud to call them, dare I say, colleagues of mine.
Wonderful. Well, maybe before we dig into your work there, we should back up and talk about your time at Harvard. So do you want to share a little bit about what that looked like, what your experience was up until the October 7th terrorist attack that happened?
Sure. So as I mentioned, I was fairly to the left on both political and religious issues. And I went to Harvard to study religion. I was the only Jew in my program who wore a yarmulke, who kept kosher, who did not believe in nuking Israel off the map. But I went to the university insistent that it's important that I move beyond my comfortable intellectual limits, that my preconceived political viewpoints be challenged, which is why I joined, for example, the Muslim Student Association Halakha events on Friday night. I went to the Jews for Palestine events. I went to the Mormon Student Association, who are lovely. And I did that because, as I said, the point of institutions of higher learning, certainly in the United States, is to challenge you to grow beyond your comfortable intellectual limits. And I was very, very excited to do that. And I always say this is true to this day. When it comes to politics especially, I'm happy to be proven wrong. If you can present a better argument, one rooted in facts and logic and data, then please tell me. And I want to be convinced. I always want to grow. And the problem I had quite quickly at Harvard is as much as I was invested in different perspectives, it was really never reciprocated. So one of the first classes I took at Harvard was a class called Religion, Nationalism, and Settler Colonialism, the Case of Israel-Palestine. And we were taught as fact that historically, the Jew has been powerless. And with the advent of the State of Israel in the 20th and 21st century, the only way the Jew knows how to exert and exhibit their newfound power is by internalizing the ways of Nazi Germany. On many of my papers, including my final paper, which is worth a decent amount of my grade, I lied. I said things that I did not believe in because I knew that it would score political and academic points with my professor if I denounced the State of Israel, for example. And it worked. But it didn't stop there. I took, or at least I applied, to take a class called Narratives and Displacement, the Case of Israel-Palestine. Almost all classes were Israel-Palestine. I'll tell you just a quick anecdote. I was banned from China for a few years for protesting with the Uyghurs, an ethnic Muslim minority who are actually facing a genocide. I have an arrest record in Poland for protesting with and for Holocaust survivors and against Holocaust desecration. Yet if you were to spend the last 3-4 years at Harvard Divinity School, at least, you would literally not know that China or Poland were countries, because the only country that, of course, is singularly obsessed and discussed and studied and debated is, of course, Israel-Palestine, which is a very, very small region. We're talking about less than 9 million people, but I digress. But I took those classes. I wanted to, again, ensure that students knew I may be Orthodox, but I'm not this conservative, insular, misogynistic Jew you all must surmise I must be. And so this particular class, Narratives and Displacement, they actually take you to what they call Palestine. I say it's what they call Palestine because the Palestine they take you to is very much Israel proper, even in accordance with international law. So I'm not entirely sure what they meant by Palestine. But you have to apply. You have to be interviewed because, of course, it's Israel-Palestine, so everyone wants to go. And during the interview, two of the professors who knew me, they said, Shabbos, we've never had someone like you apply before. And again, I didn't know if they meant because I wear a yarmulke, because my name is Shabbos, which is a very Jewish name, because I don't believe in destroying Israel. And I said, yes, it's so important I go on this trip because in my insular Orthodox community, we're not allowed to discuss Palestine, which of course is nonsense. I mean, I made that up, but that's what my professors wanted to hear. And they said, well, we're really concerned. I said, why are you concerned? They said, we're really concerned because if we take you to Palestine, which again, I'm not entirely clear how they're defining that region, when you see the apartheid, the settler colonialism, the Jewish supremacy, through the process of unlearning, which I believe is a term so monumentously dumb, only a Harvard academic can come up with it, you will be so psychologically traumatized from that trip You will be unable to reassociate yourself back with your Jewish day school, your Jewish synagogue, your Jewish community, because you'll have realized for 24 years they have been feeding you a diet of lies. And we, as your professors,
Wow.
don't want to be held responsible for that psychological trauma. So they rejected me from the program. I'll tell you one last class, then I'll shut up. This is all before October 7th. This is a class that I did not take, but a good friend of mine, Nitzan Plitman, did. She wrote an article about this. This class is called Religion and Peace, the Case of Israel-Palestine. And the professor gets up on the first day of class. And again, the only thing professors want to teach is Israel-Palestine. And the professor gets up, this is at Harvard, and she says, in politics, in media, in academia, the Zionist narrative is the dominant narrative, which is laughably not true, but okay. She says, therefore, in order to understand both sides of the story, we in this class, which again is called Religion and Peace, the Case of Israel-Palestine, will not study, will not read, will not learn, will not discuss any texts if they were written by Israelis. And this was a normal class being taught for years. So when people ask me my reaction to religious discrimination, particularly at the Ivy League, my reaction is relatively succinct, but it's relatively consistent, which is I'm shocked, but I'm certainly not surprised, because I view this as the inevitable outcome of decades and decades of political indoctrination masquerading itself as intellectual discourse and academic worth, when it is literally nothing other than a deep-seated obsession against the Jewish state, and I would take it a step further and argue a deep-seated hatred against the Jewish people. And this is all before October 7th.
This is so shocking. I think that generally, as a American culture, we were very blind to seeing the development of this deep-seated anti-Semitism growing. Right, October 7th put it on the map, and it seemed to many people to just explode right then and there. If you weren't in a situation like you, where you're going through schooling as someone who is of the Jewish faith, and then seeing the experience that you had at Harvard, and that contrast, that deep, powerful contrast, to the point where they're going to be excluding any writings from any Israelis, or just basically rewriting history essentially and presenting it as fact and truth. Where do you think that originally stemmed from, this sort of growth and building of this deep-seated anti-Semitism in the higher educational realm in America?
Well, I think you have to go back a couple of decades. Higher education in the United States, again, particularly the Ivy League, have always been progressively, no pun intended, but progressively radical, or increasingly radical, I should say. They're fundamentally opposed to the tenets of Western civilization, whether it's Harvard, Yale, Columbia, UCLA, Penn. I mean, UCLA isn't exactly an Ivy League, but it's one of the better ranked institutions in the United States. These are professors who were radicalized themselves in the 60s, 70s, some of them even in the 80s, and they stayed within the ivory tower, and they stayed Ivy Tower, and they stayed in these campuses. And those radical students have become the professors. Those professors have received tenure, and they have, in their belief, total freedom, not only to introduce political indoctrination into the classroom, but to be free from any type of accountability. So I think first and foremost, it comes from the professors themselves, who have a deep-seated hatred against the West. And that's when I talk about anti-Semitism or anti-Israel, I always focus on it being a symptom of a much greater societal ill. So for example, I had a professor who once wrote America on the whiteboard, spelled Amerikakka. You had students, this is before October 7th, who were chanting, and if you go on my Twitter, I actually have video of it, who were chanting, and I quote, "If Iran doesn't get it, shut it down." You have major problems with radicalization on these campuses. And I think anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism is just an outgrowth of much deeper problems. Because yeah, it's true, they called for the death of Israel, sure, it's true. But they also called for the death of America. And it's true, they vandalized the hostage posters of people like Fear Bibas, a 9-month-old baby who was taken hostage by Hamas on October 7th. But they also vandalized the posters of American hostages. Keith Siegel, Hersh Goldberg Poland, Omer Nutra. I'm not sure how familiar your audience is with the fact that Americans were also taken hostage by Hamas on October 7th, and many of them were killed in Hamas captivity. And yeah, it's true, they vandalized my Israeli flags. They vandalized my American flags. And I think that's what gets lost in this conversation, because I'm Jewish and people don't want to hear about anti-Semitism from Jewish people because it's getting boring. I get it. But people also have to recognize that what starts with the Jews never ends with the Jews. We are a canary in the coal mine for much greater societal ills. And I am telling you, I don't sound arrogant, but as someone who probably sat in rooms with future congressmen, future senators, even a future president of the United States, statistically speaking, that's not an absurd suggestion. We have a huge problem with young people being fed a diet of political indoctrination, particularly from their professors, teaching them to hate the West, to hate their racial identity if they're white, to hate what makes America America. And again, anti-Semitism is just an outgrowth of that much greater hatred that we really need people to wake up and realize.
No, it's really important that we hear this point that you're making, because I think you're absolutely right. There was just polling that came out, gosh, a few weeks ago that was inquiring about Americans' patriotism and feelings about their own home country, and it's disturbing. The direction is going very poorly for how we feel about our own country that we live in, and that so many people are trying to also live in right now. So I want to touch on that for just a second, because I think that connection that you're making is something that we have just generally culturally not been able to connect those dots, right? Like, this isn't just about Israel. This isn't just about Jewish people. This is about Western values, which Israel holds a lot of. We are, as you said in the beginning of this interview, America and Israel are very complementary in our ideologies, in our values. And let's talk about that a little bit, because I do want to get to the lawsuit, but I do want people to also understand why this has grown into such a predominant issue today. But I think that we have lost ourselves in understanding why the United States and Israel matter so much to each other and how similar we are. Can you speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, and again, let me clarify. It's totally legitimate and expected and normal and vital for people, whether they're Israeli citizens or American citizens, to speak out against their government or policies they don't like or the actions. That's what living in a democracy is all about. You can't do that in Tehran. You can't do that in Khan Yunis. You can't do that in almost every single country in the Middle East, particularly Muslim majority countries in the Middle East. But you absolutely can do that in Israel. In fact, before October 7th, people were talking about this growing civil war within Israeli society over Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's planned judicial reforms. There were hundreds of thousands of Muslim, Jewish, Christian, and Jewish citizens of Israel who took to the streets every single Saturday night in massive numbers to protest Benjamin Netanyahu. Again, try doing that in Tehran. I mean, they actually did try, and 40,000 of them were killed. Mm-hmm. So you can disagree with the conduct of the Israeli Defense Forces in Gaza. You can abhor Benjamin Netanyahu. You can have all sorts of political disagreements, and that's vital. Like, I've been Jewish since the day I was born, and I can't tell you how many media organizations or TV appearances or debates I've done. And people will say, do you believe that criticizing Israel is anti-Semitic? And I always say, of course not. But what I'm really interested in by that question is, have you ever met a Jewish person who says it is anti-Semitic? Because I certainly haven't. There's not a Jew on planet Earth who believes that to be a serious political approach. But what people need to realize is, outside of your political grievances against either the United States or Israel, this is a Western outpost. This is a beacon of democracy in an otherwise regressive region. Right? Saudi Arabia has just given the rights for women to drive. Israel had a female prime minister 60 years ago. Okay? They just had their largest pride parade in the entirety of the Middle East was yesterday. So this garbage notion that somehow the United States needs to forsake some of its strongest allies is silly. And I say this about Ukraine. I say this about Taiwan. I say this about any country that is an outpost of democracy and Western civilization that preserves American hegemony and American military dominance. And it's so objectively the case. When it comes to the Middle East, which is not exactly a beacon of stability, we need strong countries like Israel that can take care of their own, that can provide for us military technology, intelligence sharing. In fact, there are more unicorns and startups per capita coming from Israel than every other country on earth. Not every country in the Middle East, every country on earth. We want ingenuity, we want talent. And that's why I'm so proud to support Israel. And people often say, do you defend Israel? I've never once defended Israel in my life. Because when you have a country, that'll give you a quick anecdote that provides, let me just say a story. I was taken by the foreign minister of Israel to the Kerem Shalom border crossing, which is on the border of Egypt, Gaza, and Israel. This is in the height of the war. And the foreign minister wanted me to see with my own eyes, in the midst of the war, more than 800 humanitarian aid trucks going into Gaza on a daily
Yeah.
basis. I saw with my own eyes, hour after hour, truck after truck of feminine hygiene products, clothing, baby formula, medicine, anything you could think of were on these massive pallets going into Gaza. And it's being facilitated by Israel. And I'm standing next to a young IDF, Israel Defense Force soldier. And I'm not allowed to tell you her name, but she was younger than me. And I asked her, I said, I'm just curious, how do you feel about your job? Because your job is to clear the roads each morning at this Kerem Shalom border crossing to allow these trucks to get into Gaza. And she says, I feel a little conflicted. I said, okay, why do you feel conflicted? She says, I feel conflicted because my cousin is a hostage. I said, what? Yeah, my cousin is a hostage by Hamas in Gaza. And I said, what's your cousin's name? Her cousin's name was Edan Alexander. I'm not sure if your audience knows this. Edan Alexander is an American citizen. He was the last American to be returned from Hamas captivity thanks to President Trump. So the fact that you have a country like Israel, which faced its greatest assault in its history, where women were sexually assaulted, where houses were burnt down, where babies were kidnapped, where dogs were shot, where 1,200 Muslims and Christians and Buddhists and Druze and Jews were killed indiscriminately, including 400 teenagers at a music festival. Nevertheless, the state of Israel will ensure to the best of their ability that the people they're fighting against in Gaza can still have humanitarian aid. That's not something I defend. That's something I laud and applaud each and every single day.
Yeah, October 7th was almost too horrific to view the footage, to talk about some of what happened. And it's been a bit of a mystery to many of us here to understand how the media portrayed it in a way where we had people in this country supporting Hamas. I mean, to me, that's such a leap. Dinesh D'Souza did a brilliant film on that. I'm not going to get the name right, Rise the Dragon or something along those lines. But there was a lot of footage and a lot of audio, phone calls from these members of Hamas calling their parents and celebrating how many Jews they murdered. I mean, it was I think, an opportunity here for us to wake up to understanding that culture and the barbarism and the horror of their way of life, which is to eliminate Israel and eliminate the Jewish people. Somehow, and you can say it's a part of this overarching spiritual battle, right? Because there is that very large and predominant connector to it. But somehow the media delivered that information to Americans in a way that painted Israel in a negative light and somehow made Hamas some kind of sympathetic group to some. And they made that jump. And that was just really, really shocking here to see that some of that is still being held on to. Obviously, you were impacted tremendously by that event. And this was going on, a lot of this was going on before, but October 7th was just such a powerful, horrifying moment. Were you at Harvard during that time when that terrorist attack happened?
Yeah, so that to me is where the story kind of begins. I always say the story of October 7th is not the story of October 7th because Hamas is a dictatorial, tyrannical regime that should be obliterated from the face of the earth, but they're very clear as to what their goals are. You can read their charter online in English, and they call for the eradication of the Jew, not the state of Israel, the Jew from the river to the sea. Hassan Nasrallah, the since deposed head of Hezbollah, repeatedly stated throughout his years that it would be great for all the Jews of the world to pack up and move to Israel because, in his own words, it would be so much more convenient to kill you in one location than having to hunt you down country to country. So when terrorists commit acts of terrorism, it's bad and there must be a forceful response, but definitionally it's what they do. They're terrorists. To me, therefore, the story of October 7th is the story of October 8th. In fact, I once did a panel with MLK's niece, Alveda King, and she reminded me of this great line from her uncle. We won't remember the words of our enemies, but the silence of our friends. And at Harvard and Columbia and Penn and Yale, we would have been lucky to have had the silence of our friends. We had the jubilation, the glee, the celebration of our friends. I can show you screenshots from the Harvard student WhatsApp group before they kicked me out on the night of October 7th. As I mentioned, as Jewish babies like Fear and Ariel Bibas are being kidnapped by Muslim terrorists, as Jewish women like Naama Levy are bleeding from their private areas, as the images are being circulated on live TV in real time of the burnt, mangled, charred bodies of teenagers from a music site, as those images are being circulated, the immediate reaction of 34 student groups at Harvard, the Feminist Society, the Muslim Society, they jump out of bed, some were still in their pajamas, to draft what they called an emergency statement to blame Jews for October 7th as it was happening. And in the Harvard student WhatsApp group, students were posting pictures of a Hamas commander standing on top of a body with the slogan, "Victory is ours, glory to the resistance, globalize the Intifada." Another student had said that they're planning on a resistance rally for October 9th. And the reaction from my other classmates and friends was as if he was planning a picnic. Can I make signs? Can I bring my dog? Is this open to the public? That was the immediate reaction of America's alleged best and brightest. And that's why this is a uniquely and profoundly American issue. Because if these are America's future judges and jurors, if these are America's future policymakers, if these are America's future authors of the books your kids and grandkids are going to be reading, and they can see the murder of 48 Americans and the abduction of more than a dozen Americans, and their immediate reaction is to side with the terrorists who did that thing, then this is a profoundly and uniquely American issue. And that's where the story begins. It's the fact that those in the West, particularly those on the political progressive side, who introduce themselves with preferred gender pronouns, who take knees for Black Lives Matter, who will take up any social cause except when it came to ones involving Jewish Americans.
That's horrifying. Tell us what you did. I know you did something big. Tell us about it.
Well, truth be told, before I get into the litigation, the first thing I actually did, this is what I'm most proud of, is I went to Israel. A friend of mine, her husband was killed, and I went to actually I missed the funeral, but I made it for what's called the Shiva, the 7 days of mourning, where you visit the loved ones. But I also went with about $10,000 worth of supplies that we had fundraised just from the Harvard Jewish community, supplies that we then delivered to army bases. So things like tourniquets, things like vests, things like protein bars. So I spent 3 weeks going to army bases, delivering supplies. I spent 3 weeks digging graves for soldiers who were killed in Gaza. I spent 3 weeks playing guitar for injured civilians, including Muslims in the hospital. And I did that because, yes, I wanted to get off of Harvard's campus, but it's also because, as I said, I'm very, very proud to be Jewish. 51% of all my people live in the state of Israel. And you're damn right, I'm going to help them, because when we face our greatest existential crisis since the Holocaust, I want to be part of the solution. And Joe Rogan, who is not exactly a beacon of intelligence, he was once asked by God Saad, how many Jews do you think there are on planet Earth? He said 1 billion. And God said, a little lower. And he says, okay, 500 million, a little lower. The correct answer is 15 million. There are very, very few Jews on planet. There are more Mormons than Jews. And we Jews have been around for 3,000 years. Mormons have barely been around for 200 years. Okay, more Mormons than Jews. There are very, very few of us. And when one of us is under attack, we're all under attack. We all feel it very, very intimately. So that's really the first thing I did. The second thing I did, however, was this litigation. So we filed a lawsuit against Harvard in January of 24. We filed it not because we wanted to. We filed it not because I had expectations of a political career. We filed it because it was the right thing to do, because Harvard had so egregiously and blatantly violated Title VI of the Civil Rights Act. And I encourage all the viewers, read the lawsuit yourself, but in a nutshell, when you have an American Jewish student being spat on for wearing a yarmulke, that's religious discrimination. When you have an Israeli student at Harvard being told by her professor to leave the classroom because of her nationality, that's discrimination. When you have a Jewish student at Harvard being physically assaulted at Harvard Business School, the video of which is free on YouTube, you can all watch it, that's discrimination. When you have encampments, tents being set up on campus that impede students' ability to walk freely to campus, that follow prominently or visibly Jewish students like myself on their way to class and recording them, that's discrimination. It has nothing to do with free speech. It has nothing to do with political anti-Zionism. It has to do with a culture of systemic and pervasive religious discrimination, which is why our judge in the very liberal Federal District Court of Massachusetts, Judge Richard Stearns, a Bill Clinton appointee, he wrote a 25-page scathing ruling against Harvard, striking down their motion to dismiss, writing in part, quote, The facts as pledged show Harvard failed its Jewish students. They even added it would be, quote, dubious for Harvard to hide behind the First Amendment because A, our case had almost nothing to do with the First Amendment, and B, Harvard has restricted, regulated, and attacked the First Amendment going all the way back since 1636. This had to do with physical attacks. It had to do with religious discrimination. It had to do with a legal double standard against the university. And there are currently 8 or 9 lawsuits brought by American students across this country who've cited Kestenbaum v. Harvard, our lawsuit, as legal precedent, which is something I'm proud of. And I hope that if Americans make the mistake of going to these morally bankrupt institutions, at the very least, they'll have their constitutional protections afforded to them.
Brilliant. Tell us where things stand with the lawsuit against Harvard. Did it conclude, or is it still ongoing?
So after we had survived the motion to dismiss, which is the hardest part, I made it very clear with my lawyers that even if we were to lose everything during the trial, I wanted to go to trial because I wanted people like Alan Garber, the current president, Claudine Gay, the plagiarist and former president. I wanted them to be under oath and actually respond in a deposition. I also wanted discovery. I wanted to understand behind the scenes of who was making decisions, who was allowing this culture to continue. I have to be careful because I'm not entirely sure what I'm allowed to say, but to be a little vague and in a nutshell, Harvard filed a 1,000-page subpoena against my yeshiva in the old city of Jerusalem that I had mentioned earlier. Harvard was filing subpoenas against local synagogues across the country that I had spoken at. They wanted the entire chat log history of the Harvard Jewish student WhatsApp group, which actually led to many Jewish undergrads at Harvard leaving the WhatsApp group because they don't want Harvard lawyers looking at what they were doing. So if it was just about me, I'm fair game. You know, you can attack me all you want. They wanted the messages between myself and the Trump campaign. But when you start attacking rabbis, when you start attacking your own students, then it stops becoming about me and it starts becoming about other people. And Harvard, with their infinite amount of money and lawyers, some of whom actually serve on the Harvard board and have profited to the tune of $40 million while directing Harvard's legal counsel to themselves, which is an interesting question for another time. They pointed all their attacks on me. And so we reached a private settlement about a year ago, actually. I can't talk about the exact components of the settlement. I did sign an NDA, but if I didn't think it was a good settlement, I would not have signed it. I'll leave it at that. And then at the same time, we work hand in hand with the White House, the DOJ, Department of Justice, Department of Education, to ensure Harvard is held accountable. So I'm certainly in strong support of rescinding every last dollar of taxpayer money to Harvard University. That has very much helped. Deporting foreign students who violate our law, that helps. Cracking down on diversity, equity, inclusion, that helps. So what really, really helped is the re-election of Donald Trump to the presidency of the United States. He's been the greatest ally American students have ever had against religious discrimination by the hands of their universities.
Well, Shabbos, thank you for doing that. I'm sure it was unpleasant, exhausting, expensive, and a really difficult thing to go through, but a lot of good came out of it. And I think that it sounds like you approached it in the right way. You wanted exposure of this sort of protective bubble that they have created around Harvard University with money and lawyers that they are training and generating, right? To then come back and form this protective barrier around them. So you did a lot of good in that. What was the relationship with the Trump campaign and now with the administration in his second term?
Yeah, well, actually, I think, I'm wearing my my Trump 47 Jewish leadership yarmulke. As it
I love
happens to
it.
be. So I was part of the Jewish Voices for Trump, which was the Jewish division of the Trump campaign. So you have, Hispanic Voices for Trump, you have the LGBTQ Voices for Trump, and you have the Jewish Voices for Trump. So I was part of that. But as I said, I was a liberal, and the Trump campaign, to their credit, they reached out to me and to other young American Jews facing religious discrimination quite early on, and they said, "We want to help. What can we do to support you?" And I kind of brushed it aside because I wasn't really intending on supporting President Trump. If you were to ask me on October 6th, who the closest thing we had to the reincarnation of Adolf Hitler, I probably would have said Donald Trump. And in fact, when they asked me to speak at the Republican convention, I initially said no. There was a member of Congress, who I won't say who actually convinced me to say yes, so credit to him. But the more I was embroiled in this insanity each and every day, the more I realized that my party, the Democratic Party, the party I registered to vote as the day I turned 18, had deliberately and willingly turned their backs on American students, in particular American Jews. And the Trump campaign was telling us day in and day out, here are the policies that we're going to elevate and to get through that will support your community. And it became increasingly apparent that it was stupid for me to pretend that I don't support those policies.
Mm-hmm.
And so I spoke at a couple of Trump rallies. I spoke at the RNC. I traveled to the best of my ability across the country, encouraging American Jews, the majority of whom are registered Democrats like myself, to actually support Donald Trump. Lo and behold, he won. And actually, Donald Trump received the most amount of Jewish votes of any Republican nominee since Ronald Reagan. So pretty historic. And now that he's in the White House, as I said, we have just such tremendous friends and allies at the Department of Justice, the Department of Education, Health and Human Services, General Services Administration, the White House themselves. I mean, you name it. We have allies who are telling institutions of higher learning that if you discriminate against a single American student, you will say goodbye to every single subsidy, tax credit, and taxpayer money. And that's exactly what the Trump White House has done and is continuing to do. The expenditure of federal dollars is a representation of our values. Okay, so we do not value, we do not like, and we don't want to support any institution or peoples that discriminates against American students. It's just that simple. And your audience and the American people should be asking themselves, why has Harvard University fought against the Trump administration with greater alacrity, intensity, and transparency than they ever once even pretended to fight against religious discrimination occurring to their own students?
Yeah, that's the right question. Absolutely. And I'm glad that you're bringing that up because I want to ask you now, after all of this, after this very public battle that's gone on between a lot of these Ivy Leagues. I mean, a lot of issues in New York as well with Columbia. I mean, New York City has the highest population of Jewish people than anywhere else in the country. It was just remarkable to see what's going on there. And of course, now their political leadership is not a fan of Israel or the Jewish people. That's disturbing to see. How have things panned out to date, to this point with these Ivy Leagues? Do you think that your lawsuit, that the exposure, that what the Trump administration is trying to do in maybe withholding federal funding, do you think it's making a difference? Or do you see some of these institutions of higher learning doubling down on the anti-Semitism?
Well, yeah, it's a good question. Let me first just go back to an earlier point you had made. I don't think the American people truly appreciate this stat. Tel Aviv has about 400,000 Jews. Jerusalem, the capital of Israel, has roughly 600,000 Jews. New York City has 1 million Jews. There are more Jews living in New York City than any other city on planet Earth. Okay, there are lots of Jews in New York City. There are more Jews in New York City than any other city in Israel and including the world. So yeah, we are particularly concerned about Zohar Mamdani, which we can maybe store for another time. In terms of the particularities of your question, what is the state of play today? The only university that has really doubled down is Harvard. The Harvard is in court right now trying to sue. In fact, they are suing the Trump administration. But what's interesting is in their suit, they don't dispute the facts on the ground. They don't dispute the fact that they had discriminated against American Jewish students. They don't dispute that at all. They're willing to accept that as fact. In fact, Harvard University, they established their own anti-Semitism task force. And in the own task force, Harvard admitted that they did these things and they apologized for those things. So that is not under dispute. The only legal claim that Harvard is trying to make is the processes by which the Trump administration withheld federal funds were unconstitutional, because there should have been an investigation first. There should have been a waiting period. You should have notified us. That's their only legal argument. The way in which you held the funds was improper. So because Trump is just hilarious, he said, okay, so what did he do? He just investigated them after the fact and said, oh, we investigated you and we found that you did in fact discriminate against American Jews, which is true. And they didn't have to go very far because they just looked at what Harvard themselves had said publicly. So Harvard is the only one that has really doubled down. And again, I think that really exposes their values and priorities, or lack thereof, I should say. But in terms of institutions of higher learning across the United States, they all recognize there's a new sheriff in town, and they're scared to death of being the next Harvard because they don't want their precious American taxpayer funding to go away. So finally, they're just enforcing their own laws. And I think that's what's so remarkable about what President Trump has done. is he has exposed the fact without passing any piece of legislation that all you need to do is enforce the things that you've already passed. I mean, that's true of immigration, it's true of crime, but it's also true of religious discrimination on these campuses. Just enforce the laws already on your books. And the Biden administration allowed them to get away with not doing it. And the Trump administration said, hang on a second, you have policies, you have to enforce them. And so that's what these universities have started to do. We have seen a dramatic drop in anti-Semitic incidents on these campuses. And when I say incidents, I don't mean free speech. I mean acts of physical violence. They have almost plummeted. And it's not because these universities suddenly realized that, oh, shoot, we've treated our Jewish students poorly. They've realized, oh, shoot, I don't want to lose money. So Trump is a pragmatic guy. He knows that the dollar speaks. And so he's been very clear that we're going to withhold funds from any institution that violates the law. Just enforce the law, and you won't have these problems, which is why I always find it remarkable when those on the left say that Trump is trying to destroy higher education. There are roughly 6,000 colleges in the United States, roughly. Trump has gone after like 9, maybe 8, depending on how you count. So if he's attacking higher education, he's doing a very, very bad job. Because he's short about 5,992.
Well, he can't win everywhere, Shabbos, okay? We'll get to those later. Well, and your lawsuit against Harvard had a lot to do with that. I mean, a lot to do with helping to expose what was going on. And I'm reassured and very pleased to hear that it's made such a difference in those incidents that should never have happened in the first place. And I think that's what we continually try to wrap our brains around, right? Those who have not been infected with this sort of teeny tiny little minority group think that, Israel's responsible for everything bad or just everything in general. And if anyone has an opinion that might sound pro-Israel, that they're being paid, right? What did you do with your $7,000? I don't know. It's just ridiculous. There's such a commitment to blaming Israel for everything. So I'm glad to see there's movement within these institutions of higher education. But how would you say generally across this country, people are seeing sort of a post-October 7th opinion? And I guess I would say also a post-Donald Trump 2.0 inauguration. I mean, day one, he got to work bringing the hostages home and sorting that conflict out. It happened so quickly and extraordinarily effectively, and people were thrilled and people were relieved. And then he moved on to the next thing. You remember how quickly he was moving in those first month and few weeks of his inauguration in this second term. It's like we forgot about it really quickly. And then we got into these other conflicts. He's talking about Canada. He's talking about Greenland. We're closing the border. Tom Homan's all over the news. Now we're going down to Venezuela and now over to Iran. And it's like everyone's completely forgotten what went down in those early days of this new administration. And so I guess I want your take and your thoughts on sort of how we are viewing Israel now, because that commitment to blaming Israel and blaming Jews seems to be on the upward trajectory as things have calmed with the conflicts and the relationship with Israel, between Israel and the United States. What's your way of thinking about that?
Well, it's a great point. I couldn't agree with you more in terms of how you diagnose the political reality, in the sense that Trump is a victim of his own success. So I really do believe that the issue in 2024 that got Donald Trump reelected was in fact immigration, and it was in fact the border, and it was in fact the images that we were seeing on our screens every single day of thousands of undocumented immigrants, illegal immigrants coming into our borders, pouring into our borders each and every single day. But nowadays, no one really thinks about immigration as much because Donald Trump got illegal border crossings down 97% in the first month, because all he had to do was just close it. And it kind of underscores the lies of Kamala Harris and Joe Biden when they said, oh, there's really not much we could do, because Trump was able to get it down 97% without passing any piece of legislation, just enforcing the laws already on the books. So too when it comes to like campus anti-Semitism or the hostages. He got the hostages back. So we don't really talk about it. We don't talk about Venezuela because he got Maduro with zero life being taken from American troops. So in many cases, he's a victim of his own success. In terms of this victimhood mentality, blame the Jews. First of all, if I was being paid by Israel, I would not be living in the apartment I'm currently living in. I digress. I'm happy to give you the full tour later. It's not something to brag about.
Okay. I'll save
But
30 seconds at the end of the show for the tour.
but but more importantly, and this is what I said in the beginning, anti-Semitism is a gateway drug to full-on stupidity. And I'm deeply concerned about individuals like Nick Fuentes and Candace Owens and Tucker Carlson and Sneeko and Myron Gaines and Andrew Tate, who repeat this fiction to their millions of impressionable young people each and every single day, that the reason you have to work 2 or 3 jobs, and the reason you can't afford a home, and the reason you can't get a girlfriend is because of these shadowy, undefined forces that control your life, this cabal of elites that we're never going to name and we're never going to identify. And again, you can't do anything about them. The reason your life sucks is because something the Jews and something AIPAC and something Benjamin Netanyahu. Because you know what happens when you tell my generation that each and every single day? They're actually going to believe you. Which is why my generation is more likely than any other age demographic in this country to report feelings of isolation and suicidality, to be medicated for depression and anxiety, to engage in acts of political violence on both sides of the aisle, because they believe that I don't have human agency. I don't have free will because my life is controlled by, the Epstein class, these shadowy, undefined forces who control my life. That is an awful, scary, dangerous thing to be telling young people because they will believe it. And I think the Jewish American community does themselves a disservice when they only focus on anti-Semitism, because, as I said, that's a symptom of a much bigger problem. This five-alarm fire of young people just giving up on the system entirely. And I debated Anna Kasparian. I debated her a couple of times. I debated her most recently on the Piers Morgan show. And she had brought up, in totally bad faith, a video in which I had said, and again, she took it out of context, whereby, we Jews control the media, so what are you going to do about it? Now, again, she took it out of context because I had said 5 seconds earlier, we don't control the media. But if you do believe that we Jews control the media, what are you going to do? In the sense of, if you believe that Jews control Hollywood, so create content, build, produce, innovate. Nothing's stopping you. We live in the greatest country on planet Earth. What is stopping you? If you really believe that, Jews have this outsized role in politics and government and finance and Hollywood, I don't think we do. I don't think there are these nefarious Jews who are controlling your lives. But if you do believe that's true, then build. But there's an increasing share of our political class who don't build. They blame. The Groypers, the Nick Fuentes acolytes, they haven't elected a single member to Congress. They haven't passed a single piece of legislation. They're never on Capitol Hill because they don't do anything proactively. They don't help their own cause. They just sit in a dark corner on Twitter and Reddit and yell about something the Jews. And that's so damaging to one's psyche. It's so damaging to one's perception of themselves. And so what I keep telling people is okay, you're right. Yeah, the Jews control the world. So get involved in the political class. Do things. Create a good, meaningful life. I mean, this is why Charlie Kirk was so remarkable, because he told young people, go to church and get married and have kids and build a legacy. That's the best thing you can be doing for yourself. Instead of, again, living in your mom's basement with the lights off and engaging in bizarre conspiratorial thinking that does nothing to help yourself. That's why I'm concerned about anti-Semitism chiefly. It's not because of the death threats that I get. I don't like the death threats. I don't like the mean tweets. But it's mostly because a society that accepts anti-Semitism is a disastrously sick society. There's something seriously wrong with the direction that society is going in. Because again, anti-Semitism is a gateway drug to full-blown stupidity, to full-blown conspiratorial thinking, and perhaps most dangerously, to full-blown tapping out of society. I can't create, I can't build, I'll never have a good, successful, happy life because of something the Jews. That's why all Americans need to be concerned about this issue.
That was brilliantly well stated. Completely agree with you. I think in a lot of ways, anti-Semitism is a crutch. It's the new version of the victim mentality. You just blame someone else and then you're off the hook. So I love what you're saying. You're absolutely right. We've gotten so complacent. We've gotten so lazy. And of course, that's going to lead people to feel depressed and unworthy and hopeless. And they do. And they're medicated and they are gaming and checked out. And of course, that's going to cause those feelings of isolation and et cetera, right? And we can't just have Elon Musk being the only one doing anything in this country. I always say, thank God we still have Elon. We haven't run him off, although I will say the left has done their darndest, right? Setting the Teslas on fire and the stickers that change every week. It's like, we like him, we hate him. We're back in the Elon camp again. He's horrible. Like, make up your mind. But you're absolutely right. It's not just that group of 1 million Jews across the globe making everyone's life miserable. Let me ask you this, though, because one of the talking points, one of the allegations is that, Israel is pulling the strings. Israel's controlling political leadership and sitting lawmakers. I think I saw you giving an interview recently where you talked about Thomas Massie. Can you lay out for us realistically how much influence, maybe CARE, maybe AIPAC, maybe Israel, maybe these other influencers or funders have in reality, truthfully, with current sitting political leadership in this country?
Zero. First of all, I just wanted to talk about Elon Musk for a second because it's funny. I don't think people understand how much of a darling to the left Elon Musk was. 10 years ago, he was making cameos in the Iron Man movie with Robert Downey Jr. You would never have that again. He's a Nazi. You wouldn't have him in that Marvel movie. But this guy was going to save the world with all the electric cars, right? We were the environmentalists. This guy was Jesus. But, then he supported Trump, and then now he's a Nazi. Yeah. But anyway, okay.
So
you're asking a very, very good question. Let me say from the get-go, I am totally in support of campaign finance reform. I think there's too much money.
100%.
The fact that $5 billion with a B dollars were spent in domestic lobbying last year alone, I don't think that's good. The problem is when you only focus on AIPAC, which is number 192 when it comes to all lobbying money being spent, then you're not actually concerned about campaign finance reform, and you're not actually concerned about lobbying. You're just concerned about the Jews. But you can't say the Jews, so you'll say AIPAC. It's tired and it's silly and it's stupid. If AIPAC can just buy elections, why exactly did they allow Chris Robb to win his election? This is a guy who said that the Bondi Beach massacre, which killed, I think the number was 15, but you have to fact check me. It was either 10 or 15 Jews on Bondi Beach celebrating Hanukkah, including a 9-year-old girl, Matilda. He said that was a false flag by the Zionists. Why exactly did AIPAC allow him to win? Yeah. Maureen Galinda, who had said that American Zionist Jews need to be put into internment camps, she made it to her runoff. She won. I mean, she lost in the primary, but she made it to the runoff. How come Abdul al-Sayed in Michigan, who most likely will in fact be the Michigan Democratic candidate, who blatantly supports Hezbollah, how come they allowed him to win? This guy in New Jersey's 12th congressional district, I don't remember his name because there are too many candidates to keep track of anymore, who literally was a character witness for the Taliban. How come AIPAC allowed him to win? How come AIPAC allowed Thomas Massie to be in Congress for the last 14 years? Marjorie Taylor Greene, Rashida Tlaib, Ilhan Omar, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. If AIPAC is controlling American political discourse, they're doing a really, really bad job. But that's first and foremost. Second of all, Thomas Massie's race is a perfect illustration of everything wrong with our politics. Because you will have probably heard this fiction that AIPAC spent $30 million to get him out. No. $30 million was the total amount of money that both candidates raised. Okay? And by the way, Thomas Massie just eked out his primary opponent, Ed Gallerin, in terms of how much money. He raised a bit more, actually, than Ed did. And who did Thomas Massie raise his money from? You ready? Billionaires, including Zionist billionaires like Jeff Yass. He was endorsed by the National Iranian American Council, NIAC. He was endorsed by CARE, the Council on American Islamic Relations. He was supported by Russia Today. He was supported by a whole host of foreign lobbying groups and foreign powers, but literally no one cared. No one spoke about it because all they want to discuss is this nefarious, dark money exclusively coming from AIPAC. It's true. AIPAC's a lobbying group. AIPAC spends money on campaigns, but AIPAC is comprised of American citizens. When people say Israel, who? Who in Israel? Bibi? Bibi is as a prime minister is donating to American campaigns? No, he isn't. And if you think he is, what's the evidence? What they're referring to is AIPAC, which is comprised exclusively and legally can only be Americans.
I am the biggest advocate for campaign finance reform. I hate seeing these tens and tens and tens of millions of dollars being spent to torture the American public with ads and mailers and nonsense and dragging Obama out to lecture us that we must save democracy. I hate all of it. I hate all the union money. backing candidates, but you're absolutely right. I mean, AIPAC is just this teeny tiny little, blip on the radar screen that's being magnified and blamed for everything. And Shabbos, while I have you for a few more minutes here of this interview, this is such a great discussion, and I love everything that you're saying. It's so fascinating. And I appreciate you clarifying a lot of this too. Because when we just take our information from corporate media, right, we're getting a completely different story that we know isn't accurate. So I love talking to experts just like you so that we get the real truth of this. Final question. Is Israel its own false flag for Americans? Are we being distracted by Israel being the bright, shiny thing that we can blame for everything while simultaneously our country is infiltrated by Muslims? There is an Islamification going on. There are other nationalities coming in who hate the West, who hate our country, who hate Christianity, who hate Judaism, who hate Catholicism. And are we being completely distracted? What do you think?
Yeah, I think that's a great way to end, because that's kind of my whole point. Hate Israel as much as you want. I disagree with you, but okay, sure. That's not going to do anything to dispute the fact that since 2001, so post 9/11, which of course was the greatest terrorist attack perpetrated on American soil by Islamists. So after that, according to the Global Terrorism Index, there have been more than 58,000 Islamic terrorist attacks across the world in almost every single country on planet Earth. So you want to keep focusing on Israel? A Jew named Shabbos Kestenbaum wearing a yarmulke is not going to blow you up on the subway station. We're just not. We're not going to hijack planes and blow up buildings. You can draw pictures of our prophets. We're really not going to care. We're not going to try to proselytize. We're not going to try to convert. You can insult us as much as you want, and we're not going to behead you for leaving the faith. We're not going to enact apostasy laws. We are not going to kill our daughters for not covering her hair. You know which religion that can't be said of? Islam. And there are nefarious actors who are trying to distract us from the real growing threat of radical Islam by just blaming everything on the Jews. Oh, but the Muslims, they only hated us after the creation of the State of Israel. Really? Because the first war we ever fought as the United States of America was Islamists off the coast of Tripoli, because they had kept attacking and enslaving white Christian sailors from the United States. And Thomas Jefferson, in fact, dispatches his ambassador to go to Tripoli and ask them, we have no trade with you. We have no military quarrels. Why are you doing this? And the response was, because you're the kuffar, because you're the infidel, and we are mandated by our prophet and by our Quran to subjugate you. And it bothers me to no end. Again, hate Israel, sure, but it bothers me to no end that we have totally fallen silent to the increasing violence of radical Islam in the United States.
Yep, that's it. Clip it. That's it. Well, that is also why we are very grateful for voices like yours, Shabbos. And I'm honored that you came on the show today and that you shared with us your intellect, your candor, your wisdom, that you have such a good handle on these issues. And your viewpoint is really critical for all of us to hear. So I'm very grateful to you. Thank you for your time today, and I do hope you'll come back again in the future so we can continue digging in. I feel like we just scratched the surface here, and we want to keep hearing from you. So I do hope you'll join me on the program again in the future.
Yeah, I'd be more than happy to, and I appreciate you guys having me.
Thank you so much.
Take care.
Thank you all for joining us on this episode of Politically Basic. We're committed to breaking down the basics so that you get to decide. Be sure to check us out at politicallybasic.com and follow us across all socials at Politically Basic so you don't miss an episode, and we'll see you next time.